Welcome to Luxury on Air, where we explore the trends, innovations, and personalities defining and redefining the luxury industry.
Hello, I'm super excited to welcome you to the very first videocast edition of our Luxury on Air podcast, offered to you by Deloitte Switzerland and the Swiss Center for Luxury Research. We are just here across the street of Hyde Park in London in the showroom of the jet business, which is the first and still only jet boutique in the world. Believe it or not, I'm sitting in a fuselage surrounded by original decor of a private jet, and with me we have Steve Varsano, who is the CEO and creator of this business model. And I really thank you for hosting us in this amazing environment. It's a wow location. With us also is Edwin Brenninkmeyer, who is the founder and CEO of Oriens Aviation, who is an exclusive retailer for aircrafts like Tecnam and Pilatus, and who also service and operate aircrafts. Thank you very much for being here, Edwin. So these two gentlemen are two seasoned aviation thought leaders, and together with them, I'm going to explore a little bit the business of aviation, the challenges, but also opportunities that we see in today's world. So thank you very much for your time and for hosting us here in your private jet.
My pleasure.
Steve and Edwin, how do you get started with this business? Like, how did it all start and what are you doing now? Steve, maybe you want to start.
I started learning how to fly when I was about 14 years old. And I sold when I was 16. I got my license when I was 17, and I just thought I wanted to be a pilot. I was in love with it from when I was very, very young. And I went to university, Embry-Riddle University in Florida, which is the only really four-year aviation university in the world. And during the course of being in the university, I learned all the different facets and all the different possibilities in the aviation world, in corporate aviation world. So I decided I wanted to figure out, how I get to be the guy who's sitting in the back seat of the corporate jet rather than being in the front seat. And from there, I got a job actually on Capitol Hill in Washington, representing all the airplane manufacturers as a lobbyist, a trade organization there, the General Aviation Manufacturers Association. And it was a great job, but the money wasn't so great, so I worked at night in a nightclub, and then I met a guy in the nightclub who sold jets. And I sort of kept on hearing about how much he was making and all the sort of antics he was going through. And I convinced his boss to hire me. And that was really, I was 23 years old, and that started my career in corporate aviation.
Wonderful. And since then, you always stayed in corporate aviation?
No, I left. I sold a bunch of jets to a guy who was involved in corporate takeovers, mergers and acquisitions, in what they used to call merchant banking. Now it's private equity. And I sort of left aviation for about 17 years and was in the corporate finance world. But then I decided after coming out of that, I wanted to get back into aviation. And the whole landscape of really how the demographics of corporate aviation was changed drastically from the early 1990s to when I decided to get back in, which was 2009 or so. And that's when all the world changed and all these emerging and frontier markets, like China and Russia and Nigeria, India, all these places which at one time really it was hard getting bread on the supermarket shelves, were now the markets that were buying corporate aircraft to sort of connect themselves to other parts of the world. So I wanted to get to see a lot of my clients, because I'm just the showroom. The reason for the showroom is to see people face to face. And before, when I was in aviation, selling airplanes, it was easy to get on an airplane and see somebody in America. But since the people were now in other places, which are much more complicated to go see, I came up with this crazy idea: build a showroom, get them to come and see me. And that's how the evolution of this showroom came about.
The fact that this is the only showroom in this world is, pretty unique. What is the feedback that you're getting?
Well, at the beginning, I guess, people told me I should go check into a psychiatric hospital. To come up with an idea to build a store to sell jets and people are going to come and see me, it was really a bizarre idea. And but listen, everything is a bizarre idea until somebody does it. And so I just wanted to be different. I had a USP, a unique selling proposition that had to be different than any of the competitors. So this was the idea, and it was slow coming out of the gate. Just like a locomotive, just really tough to get going. But once it gets going and builds up the momentum, and people know what you do and what you stand for, and you get to build a brand, which is a whole nother subject, you sort of pick up that momentum, and then it sort of carries itself forward.
That's a wonderful, inspirational story already, and it also shows that the market is moving very fast. We're going to touch upon that a little bit later. Edwin, how was it for you? Where did you come from, and how did you end up in aviation?
Well, it's a little different from Steve, although it started the same. So I also learned to fly when I was 14. That's where I started. In the UK at the time, 17 was the minimum age to solo. So I soloed at 17, got my license at 17. I come from a very large family business. So I spent my early career in retail in the family business, and that's really where I learned about business, about leadership of people, that kind of thing. But I always had this nagging passion for aviation. And in fact, while I was in the retail business, we actually used my personal aircraft to visit the stores. So I got frustrated when the European Executive Board, they'd come from Brussels or Düsseldorf, they'd go and visit us in Vienna, and they'd only ever see the Prague stores, because they'd fly from Vienna to Prague, because that's where the airline connection was. And of course, with my personal aircraft, I could show them all these other stores. I could show them Ostrava and Olomouc and Brno, and there are airfields at all these places that you could visit. So it struck me that having a personal aircraft and business aviation is a very useful tool for industry. And I think that's where my desire for aviation grew. At the time, some very inspirational tech entrepreneurs were experimenting with lighter, more cost-effective aircraft. I think they somewhat underestimated the regulatory burden of aviation. And I actually explored that whole industry from venture capital. So part of our family business was venture capital. So I explored the whole value chain around the operation of these jets. So I looked at airports as part of my dissertation for my MBA, for example. I quickly learned about how operating aircraft works, the operating economics of that. There wasn't really enough deal flow, so we learned from the US, where there was deal flow, and a lot of people were doing this. Took that learning back to Europe, but there was insufficient deal flow in Europe. And that's where I started to advise these companies, how they could be more commercial, how they could write a business plan, how they could pitch for funding. And that led me to the Pilatus business and the Pilatus opportunity in the British Isles to set up a dealership from scratch. And that's kind of how, that was back in 2015.
So what does your family say that you left the original retail business and are now in aviation retail business?
Well, the family has always been very entrepreneurial. That's the whole ethos of the family. We've been entrepreneurial for 6 generations. So the idea, that a family member strikes out on their own and does something that they're passionate about, and if they see an opportunity to go for it, is wholeheartedly supported. And it's something that even within the family business, members are striving to do all the time. It's to be entrepreneurial, find a new angle, which is why Steve's story was so inspiring. That he had the guts to pursue that dream, and had the tenacity to pull through, and made it very successful. That's the story of entrepreneurship.
Yeah. So your family didn't want to sign you in the psychiatric clinic?
Well, they probably did, but they maybe at the time.
Now, coming a little bit into the market and your whole business, I think for many people, aviation is a big black box, like yachting, for example, too. We already had one podcast episode on that. So can you tell us and our viewers a little bit about who are the big players, who are the big manufacturers, what are the models, and especially what is the price ticket, and with what do you have to calculate when you want to buy a private jet?
Well, in the jet market, there's really a small number of manufacturers. Okay, you have Pilatus, which makes a PC-24. You have Cessna, which is a Textron corporation, which are making sort of small and mid-size jets. You have Embraer, which are making small, mid-size, and super mid-size airplanes. You have Falcon Jet, Bombardier, and Gulfstream, which are really sort of from the super mid-size to the ultra long-range aircraft. And then you have the Boeing and the Airbus aircraft. So really, it's that whole gamut. And also on the lower end, Honda Jet makes a small jet. Those are the biggest players in the world, and they probably, I'd say, approximately 60% of the market is in the United States, and about 15 to 20% of the world market is in Europe, and then the rest is scattered between Africa, Asia, and South America.
And those manufacturers, I mean, I know that Pilatus is Swiss, for example, but Gulfstream, I think, is American, right?
Yes.
And Bombardier is Canadian. Is there any other players coming from other markets?
Well, there's some new players in the whole next generation of aviation in the eVTOL, the electric vertical takeoff and landing, and electric aircraft. That's a whole new generation of manufacturers that are coming, and they might get bought up by existing manufacturers. But for right now, they're sort of a lot of guys, if you want to call it, people in their garages that are coming up with incredible technology. And then there's some other companies that are very well funded by private equity or by car companies and things like that, really getting into that next world of aviation and transportation.
We're going to talk about that a little bit later too. Can you tell us a little bit about the sizes? I have no idea when you talk about small and mid-size and super mid-size and large. What is mid-size, for example?
Okay, mid-size is like sitting inside a minivan or a Viano. Okay, it's probably the best comparison. What you're sitting in right now is not normal. Okay, this is unfortunately the perception of what corporate aviation is, but in fact, out of 24,000 jets in the world, there's probably only about 250 that are like this, and out of the 250, more than half of them are heads of state. So really, you're talking about 100 airplanes out of 24,000 that are like this. That's the perception, but it's not the reality. The reality are like the PC-24 in the jet market I'm talking about, not in the turboprop market. The small and mid-size jets are, about 60%, if not more, of the airplanes, and they're really, an airplane for a 2-hour flight, they can go 4, 5, 6 hours. But the average flight of all corporate jets is something like 2.3, 2.4 hours and 2.4 people. So really those size jets can accommodate most trips. But just, there's the offshoot where you get some that have 10 people, you get some that have 2 people. But really it's really for much more regional flying in the overall scope of things.
And I think if I may just add to what Steve said, I think there's also, we at Oriens Aviation, I mean, going back to my background and also Steve's background, we started learning to fly, got our passion for aviation right at the very start. So there is also an upgrade path. People learn to fly in an aircraft, they get bitten by the bug and the passion for flying. And then they gradually upgrade. They start in a training aircraft and maybe they get a personal aircraft, they fly themselves, then they move up, and there is that upgrade path. So that's kind of where we come in. We're introducing people to the very start of aviation. So we work with Tecnam, for example, which is an Italian manufacturer that mostly work with training aircraft. They do some personal aircraft as well. And we're also a service center for Cirrus. So Cirrus is a very big brand that's not a jet. Well, it is a jet. They have a jet as well. But it's more a personal jet, but it's very much at the entry level. So people who've learned to fly, they then experience the joys of flight through a Cirrus, either the piston or the jet, and then they move up and they move on into the world that Steve was talking about. So there's very much an upgrade path as well.
Do you have an idea how many people, in terms of a percentage, fly themselves of those owners of a private jet?
In the private jet, it's very, very tiny. I mean, it is very tiny. Let me just be clear. We're talking about personal jets, private jets, corporate jets. All jets are owned by corporations. Okay, nobody really buys a jet for personal pleasure use. It just doesn't happen, and it's all because they have a business use for it. So sometimes when you on the smaller airplanes, the turboprops or things like that, or reciprocating engines, they have a lot more owner pilots. But the fact is, when you get into a jet, you know, usually these are pretty big business people. They have so much going on in their head, and it's actually probably not a wise decision to be flying your own jet. And usually when it happens is when they have an owner pilot, most jets are 2 pilot requirements, okay? And they always have the other pilot. And people who fly for one of these guys, or gals, whatever, that they actually don't like flying with those kind of people because they take all the fun part. I mean, the other pilot who's working for this owner pilot, you know, does all the flight planning and checking on the airplane and getting it positioned and putting it to bed and taking it out of the hangar and getting everything ready. And the principal just shows up, gets out of his car, getting in a jet, let's go, and takes off. And after he gets up in the altitude, he gets in the back and sits with his, you know, executives and things. And then he's ready to land. He comes back and okay, I'll take it from here. And the poor co-pilot doesn't get to fly. So, you know, he takes all the fun parts out of it. But the fact of the matter is if you really had to take all that you have to do to be a safe pilot, it's probably, you know, it's such a tiny, tiny piece, and that's because of the safety factor.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to what Steve said. I mean, that's very much the case. And as Steve rightly said, I think at our end, there are more owner pilots. So not flying the jet, but certainly flying the turboprop, you do get more owner pilots. And that's really where we can help them. You know, if they've come from a Cirrus or a smaller aircraft or a Vision jet and they're moving up, it's that ability, as Steve said, as they move up in the world and they're spending more money on their own personal aircraft, their responsibilities are also increasing, their business demands and pressures are increasing as well. And we can provide that full range of services where we can still get them to fly the aeroplane, but we're essentially acting as a safety pilot and doing all of that grunt work that Steve mentioned, taking that all off them so they get to enjoy flying the aeroplane safely, you know, with a safety pilot who can help them if they're fatigued at the end of the day, they've had stressful meetings, you know, the safety pilot's still there to monitor them and to help them in that situation. But Steve's absolutely right, but the time they move on to the jet, you know, typically the PC-24 or larger, they very rarely fly themselves. You get the occasional John Travolta, but it's very rare.
It's also very interesting in terms of the use of the private jet, because we always put yachts and jets somehow in the same bucket, but the use seems to be very different, right? Because yachts are mainly for hedonic or pleasure purposes, but a jet is really a business mobility tool, if I understand correctly.
A jet is a capital expenditure. It's a time machine. It's really to, you know, increase the flexibility of a corporate executive. I mean, it's used all year round. You know, a yacht is, you know, really for a certain time of year in a certain place. It can be used for business just as much as you could say golf does. You know, you're building relationships with other people, and you know that's the other thing. You know, people who are working for companies that have a corporate jet or have a yacht, these people are pretty significant in the business world, and people think they just have such an easy life. There really is no off time for these people. These people really are on 24 hours a day, and when they actually are going to a vacation spot, I guarantee you they're going to see other people who are in their sort of peer level that are also operating companies. They're talking business with them. Their husband or wife are partners in that whole you know, business world, and they're just never turned off. They're actually not happy if they're going someplace and there's nothing to talk about business. So people think that they use for personal use, but really there is no real personal use. You know, everybody thinks of this balance of work home thing. It's not a reality. People who are flying for companies that have airplanes, your work life is your personal life. And that's just something that, you know, people don't understand unless you're actually in that world.
I think Warren Buffett, he started by calling private jets the indefensible, and then he got converted and called them the indispensable because they're such an invaluable business tool. And I believe, and Steve will know this better than I do, but I believe the majority of people that fly in a business jet in the US are actually middle management.
Yeah, it's over 70% of all passengers in a corporate jet. Over 70% is middle management. Yeah, so, and then you have the C-level, you know, the CEO, CFO, you know, those kind of people. They are actually taking up the other 25%. I mean, the charter market is more for personal use. than the owner of a corporate aircraft.
Now we're coming already to the big myths of the private jet business.
There's a lot of those.
This is what I wanted to ask. Like, what do you think are the biggest myths that are out there that we can clarify now?
You want to start?
I think we've already touched on some of them. So I think there is a perception that private jets are just a toy, but there's so much more to a private aircraft than a toy. And as Steve has quite rightly said, that this environment is not typical of a private jet. The cabins are much smaller. People are on the aeroplane. They choose to fly a private jet because it affords more privacy, so they can actually hold a meeting or talk about confidential information on the aircraft, so they can use their travel time productively. They're flying on their own schedule, not an airline schedule. They can get back to their families at night, so it improves their family time rather than having to stay overnight in a hotel. And that's really where the private jet comes into its own. So it's not it is very much also the pleasure of flying a jet, but it's also the business tool and the productivity that's afforded by a private jet as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'll punch this one right in the face, okay? This idea that the corporate jets are damaging the environment is something that is really the biggest misnomer and falsehood there is. Our industry has probably done more and is doing more to get sustainability and to get zero emissions than any other form of transportation in the world. They're doing electrification, they're doing carbon offsetting, they're taking carbon CO2 out of the atmosphere. I mean, there's leaps and bounds over any other form of transportation. And the fact of the matter is the corporate aviation is contributing 0.04% of the CO2 issue, which, by the way, the CO2 percentage of the atmosphere is 0.02% of the atmosphere. So if you really, really look at it, the CO2 of corporate jets as a part of the atmosphere is like 0.0008%. It's not a contributing factor. And unfortunately, that's the perception, but it is probably the tiniest of any form of existence, whether it's food, whether it's clothing, whether it's transportation, whether it's anything in the world. Corporate aviation is the least contributor. So, and they're doing the most to even reduce that to the negative, not even zero, to negative. So I think that's the biggest myth.
I think exactly right. I think as you said, I think our contribution to the environment or to damaging CO2 emissions is so small, but that doesn't mean we're ignoring it. On the contrary, I think we're so passionate about doing everything that we can, the responsibility that we collectively have as human beings on this planet. I'm not even talking about aviation, to try to preserve the planet for future generations. And we are very actively as an industry working hard to do better. We offset all our flights, so we have what's called an AOC, so we're operating aircraft. We just offset them. We don't even give the customer a choice. We just do it. And frankly, also, there is a lot of funding that's now being attracted to innovation. And that's the exciting thing for me as an entrepreneur as well. I think we as a species, human beings on this planet, are very smart. We're very intelligent. We got rid of coal fires in the 1950s when we had smog. I'm an optimist. I think as an entrepreneur you have to be. And I believe that human beings are smart and are resourceful, and we will find a solution. And funding is now being diverted towards this. And I'm personally investing in an electric aviation startup. The regulator is acknowledging this, and they're allowing more flexibility to be innovative and to experiment with new technology at the sub 600 kilo level. So that's where the innovation's happening. To Steve's point, it's very much happening at the lower end, where you can get proof of concept safely and then expand that and scale it to the larger aircraft, and then the whole industry will benefit. So it's an exciting time, I think.
I mean, the industry does so much more than it does damage. I mean, it's moving, businesses forward. It's employing, millions and millions of people. The world is not going to solve problems like this by going backwards. It's going to solve things by technological advancements and with artificial intelligence, quantum computing, these kind of things. I think nobody really knows how fast or what we're going to discover tomorrow or next week or next month. I mean, everybody thinks in a very linear way. Oh, it's been like this 30 years ago, this is 20 years ago, 10 years ago, this is what we're going to do 10 years from now. The world's not acting like that anymore, and the wealth of information and advancement is just going like a hockey stick, and I don't think people understand that. You can't put down your guard and say, oh, it's going to happen, let's not worry about it. But you know, the world was worrying, I don't know how many times 30, 40 years ago that we would never have enough food to serve everybody in the world, and now more people die because they overeat instead of undereat. So, you know, the world just evolves and adapts, and I'm sure there's going to be so many more advancements that's just going to take this problem off the table.
And you just mentioned it in the beginning of our episode today, that when you left the industry and you were coming back, that so many things had already changed. And I would like to transition to another question that I have around that. Just in the past years, where there was so much change in our environment, also pertaining to Corona, for example, what were the biggest changes that you saw in the last, let's say, 5 years? Let's say pre-COVID, during COVID, and since then.
Well, I mean, big changes. There was a study pre-COVID, I believe it was McKinsey, who said that 90% of people who could afford to travel privately chose not to pre-COVID. And COVID changed all that. So I think there was a lot of new people came into the industry because of COVID. They wanted the biosecurity that private aviation could afford, you know, rather than sitting in a large airliner sharing the cabin air with lots of other people. So, and I think once people experience private aviation and business aviation, they really learned about the benefits that it can provide. It's not just simply getting from A to B, it's all the other benefits that we've already talked about. So the industry has, strangely, but thank goodness, it really has benefited very much from COVID. It's introduced more people to the industry.
Yeah, there's no question. And you know, this term luxury, which is the subject of this, you know, podcast, I think there's two sides of luxury. I think corporate aviation, you know, because I don't, you know, say corporate aviation is luxury. It's a time machine. However, if you want to look at one definition of luxury, it should be time and convenience. And that's where luxury in corporate aviation comes into play. You know, the fact that you get more convenience. And there's the other side of it, which is, you know, the brand, the ego, the status. That's luxury on a different side of the scale. But the true luxury of corporate aviation is having the flexibility, having the convenience, the safety, security. There's so many other things. That's, if you want to put it under a name, luxury, fine, it can be called that. But it's a completely different luxury than most people perceive the definition to be.
So we had a customer that actually called his aircraft Marty. That was the registration because of Marty McFly, because it was his time machine. So.
That's nice. And I saw also at the entry of your door that there is the saying, time is money, buy yourself a jet. Yes. So now comes the literal $1 million question. How much money do you need to buy a jet?
Well, you know, actually, it's not as much as you think. Of course, the sky's the limit. You can spend as much money as you want. It's sort of like, you know, how much does it cost to buy a car? You know, you could buy a car for nothing. You can go in and start making monthly payments and have a car. Corporate jets, they can go anywhere. It depends. New, they're probably, the low end is probably around $4 million up to, you know, 100 million. But pre-owned, you can buy jets for hundreds of thousands of dollars as an older airplane, but the maintenance on them is much higher. So you have to find where's that line that makes sense, where age and reliability and reduced maintenance costs sort of. And really the question is what's your mission? That's really the key thing, and that's one of the things we do here in the jet business and on our video wall and our app. What is your mission? Because again, as I said before, nobody buys a jet, no company buys a jet just to have a jet. You're trying to fulfill a mission. So people need to know how far you got to go, how many people you want to carry, you know, how frequent is your trip, you know, what's the budget? And when you look at all those things, you know, it spits out an answer and says, this is the airplane that fits your needs. And, you know, do you go in a short field? Do you go in a long field? Is it high altitude, low altitude? There's so many different things that get put into the sort of computer and comes out with an answer. I think, you know, if you looked at the average price of a pre-owned jet in the world, it's probably $7 or $8 million. You know, and that's for not an old airplane, but not a new airplane. And like I said, you can go way up or you can go way down. It really depends on what your mission is, and that's so important because it's mission driven.
So if I could extend your question further, I think the entry to private aviation isn't necessarily buying an airplane. It's usually charter. That's usually where people start. So people get the experience. They're maybe considering buying a personal aircraft, but they don't know much about private aviation. So the first step is, well, I'm going to Paris this weekend, you know, let me charter an aircraft. And then they get to assess the different missions and the different aircraft, and then they get to learn about the aircraft. And that's typically where people start. And then they move on to fractional ownership once they get to a certain number of hours. That really is the best model. And then after that, if they really fly in the airplane a lot, or their business is flying the aircraft a lot, they then move to buying the airplane outright. And the other benefit, of course, if you're buying an airplane, and let's say you're flying between 200 or 300 hours a year yourself, you can then also offset your costs by chartering the aircraft out. So the customer does have the option as well of reducing his cost base or her cost base or the company's cost base by making that asset productive when they're not using it themselves. So there's all these different options.
What I also find very interesting is the pre-owned version. I think we normal people, when we think of private jets, we always think it's just the latest in the news, but that there is a whole business of pre-owned and refurbishing those aircrafts and reselling them. So is that something you're doing, like refurbishing aircrafts?
We don't refurbish aircraft, so we do sell pre-owned aircraft, but we're very specialised. You know, we focus on the aircraft that we specialise in. I mean, Steve does all of them, so he's got broader experience. But yeah, I think there's a trade-off. I mean, if you're buying a new aircraft, then the entry cost is much higher. You know, it's a much higher dollar amount. But you're benefiting from the aircraft being under warranty. You know, usually benefiting from a maintenance program. So the cost of operating that aircraft is typically a lot lower, and that's something that we've experienced. I'm sure you've experienced this as well. A lot of people, they think, wow, I can buy a really big jet for a surprisingly low sum, but they've got to ask themselves, there's a reason for that. You know, they've got to look at the engines. Most engines are actually on a program, so they would be buying into that program. But typically the cost of you know, you mentioned refurbishing, so bringing the aircraft's avionics up to modern standards can be astronomically high. So there might be all these costs, the maintenance costs that are due, you know, of let's say a pressurized fuselage that's had lots of cycles of being pressurized and depressurized. There's lots more maintenance checks that become due with older aircraft, and that depresses the acquisition cost, but can really inflate the operating costs.
Yeah, I mean, like Edwin said, I mean, first of all, I probably tell 25% of the people who talk to me about buying an airplane don't buy an airplane. I actually tell them, you don't need an airplane, you're not using one enough. And you should do exactly what he's saying. You should charter, you should buy a fractional. And that's a better, you know, use for the model you have. And you get to a certain point, whether it's, you know, we sort of say if you're going to fly more than 150, 200 hours a year, you can start justifying the acquisition of an airplane. But I'm not talking about from a financial standpoint. I'm talking about from a logistical standpoint. Because you never really can tangibly say it's cheaper to fly on a corporate aircraft than on a commercial airplane. The problem is that most of your benefits are intangible from a financial standpoint. You know, if you are living in some city that's not in London or New York City or Paris, and you need to fly, you know, you have to drive hours to get to a commercial airport. And then it's going to take you to an airport that's not necessarily close to where you're at. Most people, for example, would have an airplane and leave, let's say, out of London or somewhere else in England and want to fly to somewhere in the south of France and then go to South Italy and then go up to, you know, let's say Germany. And they can do all that and be back home that night. Now, if that's a corporate executive, there's a value to that person's time to be in the office, working, be in contact with his office all the time on the telephone in the airplane. And he might say, you know what, I have to go to these 4 places, but, you know, flying commercial, I don't have 4 days to do this. I'm not going to go. And there could have been a multi-million-dollar contract that they missed, or a property they could have bought, or anything like that. And so they pass up a lot of these opportunities because it's too inconvenient to go to. So those are the tangible benefits of having a corporate aircraft. You actually don't think about it. On the spur of the moment, you go and do something. And that's the whole way of being successful in business, being someplace or somewhere where other people just don't go. And that's a big, big benefit that you just won't fly if it's too inconvenient for commercial purposes.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I would like to touch on one subject that I know is very dear to you, Edwin, and I would also like to hear your opinion about that, Steve. And is the integrity of the business. I think another black box where we from the outside don't have a very clear idea about who are the people and how do you ensure good business practices in a business that is, maybe a little bit secret for many outside people.
Gosh, where do I begin with that one? I think the first thing is my background. So I've come from a family business. I'm one of the youngest of the 5th generation, the 6th generation already in charge. So we've been doing business for a long time, and I think we've always prided ourselves on acting with the highest integrity. I think that's the secret to long-term success, long-term value creation, is doing business ethically. And it's the same in business aviation. It's a very, very small industry. Everyone knows everyone else. If you develop a reputation for acting with integrity and acting for long-term value creation, you're just going to succeed. And I've read lots of books about doing business ethically. And you read it, and actually it's just fundamental good business sense. There's no rocket science behind it. But let me give you an example. If, let's say, during difficult times, you've got aircraft in stock that you're struggling to sell, the temptation is always going to be there to sell that aeroplane to the first person who walks through the door. And as Steve quite rightly said, one of the most important things is, what's your mission? Is this aeroplane right for you? So if you sell that person the wrong aeroplane because you're under pressure to sell that aircraft in the short term, but you don't think about long-term value creation, that person's never going to come back to you, and you've ruined your reputation as a business. If you say to that person, you know what, I don't think that aeroplane is suitable for you, as Steve was saying before, and he walks away and buys something else, he's going to say, you know what, I really trust those guys. They've told me the truth, and I believe in what they're telling me, and as a result of that, I'm going to do business with them in the future. And I think it's not just working with customers, it's also how you work with your employees. And that's something that I'm trying to develop now in my business, is have a purpose. Are we in the business of selling airplanes, or are we in the business of increasing business productivity, of creating a dream? Maybe somebody's always wanted to have an aircraft, and now they have the opportunity and they have the freedom to fly. Are we giving people freedom? What are we actually in the business of doing? Is it really just selling airplanes? If you go to a restaurant, is it all about food, or is it about connecting people? Is it about a shared experience? So what is the business that we're in? And if your staff have that sense of a purpose and they have fun doing that and delivering that, guess what? They're going to enjoy working with each other more. There's going to be a very positive culture and a rapport within that business that the customer will also see, and that will actually feed through to the customer as well. So it permeates every aspect of the business, and it includes the suppliers, everyone that you touch in the business. That culture has to be there. And I think that's a very sound, fundamental business sense.
Yeah, I think, listen, we live on and survive on a reputation, on referral business, repeat business, but it goes back all again to brand. If you have to build your own brand, and your brand has to stand for something, because the general brand in the luxury world, let's say, it sort of reduces risks. It gives it a value. It shows you what you stand for versus competition. So, if you really, thank goodness we don't have to sell an airplane next week to pay our rent. We're successful in what we do, and if we don't like the person that we're talking to, we just won't do business with them. So we have that luxury of pick and choosing who we want to deal with. And in our world, believe me, we have some real winners that we have to deal with. And because, we're more successful with doing business with the decision makers in a corporation, an entrepreneurial-led company, not so much the Fortune 1000 company, where you have sort of different levels of boards and committees to deal with, because we just have more success, communicating our message to the decision maker and telling them what they need or what we can do for them, and try to get to their objective by understanding what their needs are. And if it goes through different layers, you sort of lost through translation, what you're trying to get through. And when you talk to those decision makers, I mean, they are strong, successful, powerful, in every sense of the word. They know what they want. Sometimes they don't know what they want, but they think they do. And you sort of have to listen and listen and listen. But the fact of the matter is if you have 1 inch, fraction of insincerity, okay, or mistrust that comes across, you are finished. They just discard you in 2 seconds, and you are finished. So you really, I know when I'm talking to somebody, it is a sincere conversation I'm having. I'm trying to learn what they're trying to achieve and trying to see if I can, do that for them. It's not how do I outsmart them and how do I get around it. It's an attitude. And I think that's part of our brand ethos. And I think, we know who the people are like that in our industry, and we know the people who are not. And you try to just stay away from the people who are just not that kind of a personality.
Mm-hmm. I very much like the term ethos also behind, because it really speaks to your vocation of doing what you're doing. So can you talk a little bit about what do you really love about what you're doing? What is the thing that really makes you tick and get up in the morning and say it's just...
Well, for me, it's the adrenaline of the people who I work with. Mm-hmm. There's no question. Whether I'm now selling airplanes, it's like the back of my hand. I know it. I know what I'm doing. It's great and it's fun. I love it. It's something I know everything about. But really, every single person we're doing business with, I learn something from, and it's a challenge, and it's a tough challenge. Sometimes I pulling hair out of my head. So why am I in this? They're driving me crazy. They're driving me nuts. How can they do this? But the fact of the matter is there's different cultures in this world, and if you don't understand that, you will never succeed in this business. Because, people who want to think that everybody should do business the way you do it, you're going to fail. You have to understand how people think, what's important to them, and try to see if there's some middle ground of what you're trying to achieve and what they're trying to achieve, and make both sides happy or equally less happy. And that's really the adrenaline I get out of doing this business, is just learning, a sponge of information, and also given my experience, and giving it to some people who think they know everything, and be able to educate them. There was a clothing company in New York when I was a kid. I remember it had its advertising moniker was, "An educated consumer is our best customer." And I don't know why, it stuck in my head for my whole life. And so we really like to educate the client, and through our app and our technology, that's really, people see it. And because you can't tell a successful person you don't know what you're talking about. You just can't do that. But you could show them that they don't know what they're talking about. And they understand that quickly, and they say, wow, there's something here I didn't know. And now they turn around and start being more open, because they see you can actually help them. That's the key. That's really the icing on the cake, getting them to appreciate what you're doing for them.
And the first step to be able to do that, you have to first earn their trust. And of course, that goes back to doing business ethically again. So, it goes back to that. But I think I would completely agree with Steve. I think it's the same thing for me. I think it's such a personal thing and an individual thing. When you're working with a customer, they're all different. They all have unique needs. Similar to Steve, we also work with decision makers. We work with entrepreneurs who have their own business. And it's understanding what their requirements are for themselves, for their business, and earning their trust is step number one, and then being able to educate them. Most jets will fulfill 80% of the customer's mission. It won't fill 100%. There are going to be some things the jet just simply won't be able to do. And so there's going to be a little bit of a trade-off, and I think it's sitting down with them, being open and honest with them, earning their trust, educating them, and then delivering a service that's unique to them, to that particular person. It's not the same service for all. It's very tailored, very individual, very specific. And then the real joy comes at the end of that process, when they really get their, deliver value from their aircraft and it exceeds their expectations. I had that experience myself. We both did, flying, and it's that whole beauty of flight and joy that aviation can bring, and that increase in productivity, that increase in business success. That, you know, that all those things come together.
Do you still have time for enjoying the beauty of flying?
I do. I'm very, very, very privileged to. I still do a lot of flying. So I do fly for our charter company. So I do fly the line. I tend to do a lot of the demonstration flights myself, because I think it gives credibility to our business if the owner and CEO of the business flies the aeroplane him or herself. So I do the demonstration flights, and that builds the rapport with the customer. So you get to meet the customer, you get to understand them, you've got to be very attentive and listen to what their needs are. So yes, I fly the aeroplane myself for demos. I do charter flying, and I also do a lot of personal flying outside of business as well. A lot of different types of aircraft. So I'm an addict.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't get to fly anymore. But I fly in all the corporate jets all the time, or the turboprops, and I love that. And I'm always find myself, going up to the cockpit and talking with the crew and watching what's going on, and again absorbing more what's happening up there and learning what's happening up in the cockpit. So it's something I definitely still in touch with and love. But unfortunately, I know my limitations. If I was sitting there trying to fly an airplane today, I'd be on my phone answering some message, and I forget to put the landing gear down or some crazy thing. My brain is on, too occupied, and I just know the limitations. I get myself in trouble.
Would you say there is something like a private aviation lifestyle?
I don't know. I think I'm fortunate enough. I think that a lot of our social circles, are people who use corporate aviation, and so we and the places we normally go on holiday are usually places where a lot of these people are. And so again, as I was saying at the beginning of this conversation, I'm never really on vacation. Even if I'm on vacation, I'm out networking, I'm talking business. But that to me is fun. That's part of, again, my ethos, my work, sort of my idea of work. And I've been doing it, I've been working since I'm 7 years old, sweeping floors in a restaurant and a beauty salon. I'm happier when I'm working and just creating or learning.
Mm-hmm. We're slowly coming towards the end of our podcast, and I have a couple of more personal questions. This is normally how we do it. Maybe one question about fun facts. Is there any peculiar thing that a customer ever wanted to have in the interior of a private jet?
Well, I can tell you, this is the most boring answer you'll ever get, because it's the truth. Nobody does anything crazy in the interior of a corporate aircraft. It's everybody asks this question, but the fact of the matter is it is a piece of transportation. It's like saying, what do you do to the inside of your car? Okay, it's not anything I'm not saying nobody ever has done it, but you're in this tube for many, many hours. It's not like you're in a house where you make one room special or a different piece of art up there. You're in a tube. There's no place of decoration in there. It's just, there's some windows and a shell. And unless you're on one of these kind of Airbus or Boeings, I mean, it's not a luxury kind of idea. It is transportation, and it's getting from A to B, and it's the most boring answer I know you're expecting, but that's the truth of the fact.
That was another myth we had to uncover.
It's another myth, yeah.
So yes, I agree. In fact, we almost advise our customers not to spec their airplane because one thing we're very proud of with our products is the residual value. So our aircraft have the some of the best residual values in the industry and in the markets. We're very proud of that, and we say to our customers, well, just think about that. So if you're going to spec a very garish interior or a very striking paint scheme, which some customers do, and they like it, but it might impact the residual value of your aircraft when it comes to sell the airplane. So it's just something to bear in mind. So it's a bit of a joke between ourselves and Pilatus. Most of our customers tend to spec, or a lot of our customers tend to spec the outside of the aeroplane in a sort of metallic blue with silver. So Pilatus say, you can tell it's an Oriens aeroplane because it's blue and silver.
Yeah, the outside's different.
Yeah. Well,
the outside you can be a little more creative, but the fact is the inside. And then most people want their privacy anyway. And if you make it too obvious, then you're not blending in. You're making it a little bit more stand out. So you can't have your cake and eat it too.
And can you share any of your craziest stories that you ever had in your career in this business?
Oh gosh. Have you got one? Well, you definitely got one, so I know you got a few. So.
I mean, you know, my very first jet I ever sold, that's the old time one where actually I was, you know, on the delivery flight with two representatives of the buyer, and they wanted me to pay them a fee, and I was trying to argue with them, but they were South American, and we were flying to Miami, and they said, well, you know, you're going to come with us to our country, and you know, we'll get it all settled up. I'm like, you're crazy. I said, I'm getting out of Miami, and this deal's over. And he pulled out a gun on me, sitting inside this little airplane, this little jet, and said, no, you don't understand. You're coming with us, and if we don't ever get our money, you're never going to go home. It's my first aircraft transaction. And so I was held at gunpoint to try to get them to pay a fee. I ended up escaping when we landed, because in those days we didn't have mobile phones, and I had to go into what they call a fixed base operator, where we fuel the airplane up. And I actually escaped from these guys, but I was shaking in my pants for the next month when they would come after me. But that was the first aircraft transaction I ever did, and why I stayed in the business after that, I'll never know, but here I am. So,
I was just about to say, you really need to love your job. Wow.
Yeah.
I can't top that story. I really can't. But I mean, I think it was probably the first or the second aircraft we sold. So I just set up my business. You know, we're a new startup, you know, desperate to make this work. And of course, if you've just started a company, you tend to be all things, you know, to all people, and you're very thinly spread. And we had an aircraft delivery, which coincided with the Goodwood Festival of Speed. And we thought, how on earth are we going to do this? How am I going to be in two places at the same time, delivering this aircraft for the customer and going to the Festival of Speed? So we decided to invite the customer to Goodwood. We said, hey, you know, fancy coming to Goodwood? We've got a little surprise for you. And we delivered his aeroplane at Goodwood. That solved the problem. The customer was completely amazed. He thinks it was all intentional. So I'm now saying to the public, and if the customer's listening, he knows now that it wasn't quite intentional. So confession time, but it worked out beautifully. So yeah, that's my story.
I like yours better.
I wasn't held against
Two very smart entrepreneurs. Maybe to end up this podcast, what would be your recommendation for anyone who has entrepreneurial mission and who is new in a business? What is your learning after your many years as an entrepreneur?
Well, there's two different answers there. The first one was, you know, a business person, what's your advice? My main advice would be stop apologizing for your success. Buy a jet. Okay, that's from an existing business person. But from an entrepreneurial, if you're starting up a business, I mean, listen, you have to really, really love what you do. That you just have to live, you know, breathe, eat that subject, that whole thing. And you just have to have an attitude that no matter what happens, no matter how bad it gets, I have to stick with it and stick to it. It's entrepreneurship is the loneliest job in the world, and it has some real lows. Okay, everybody sees, you know, the kid who gets an app and the next day he's got $1 billion. That's not reality. And there's just so many down times, and you can't really share it with a lot of people if you're a true entrepreneur. So you just have to be ready for it. It has so many gratifications. It's just, you know, everybody loves feeling good about doing something themselves. And that's the whole key to being an entrepreneur, really thinking, wow, I created this. It was me. I did it. It just, everybody likes to feel good about themselves. But you just have to be ready for that down time, and there's a lot of them. So you got to just keep going, because guaranteed tomorrow's going to be better than today.
Yeah, so following on from what Steve said, I think, you know, clearly I'm an addict. You know, I love flying, so I'm very, very passionate about it. So I would like to encourage more young people to come into this industry, because it is a really cool industry. It really is. I mean, it's you know, I've been very privileged to been in this industry for a long time, and I think that, you know, what Steve said as well. I think have a purpose, find that niche. You know, what's the niche? What is the problem you're trying to solve? using aviation. If you have that purpose, that'll get you through the difficult times. Have that purpose, remember the good moments, the joy of the customer when he got his aeroplane in Goodwood, and he's seeing the success of his aircraft and his business transformed by using his aircraft, and that gets you through the difficult times. I really think that's the key, and I think honestly now is a very exciting time to enter the aviation industry for all the reasons we've touched on before. There is so much innovation happening, there's so much technology happening, there's a real drive to make the industry more sustainable, to improve what we're delivering and make it greener, make it more environmentally friendly. And I think that's something that resonates with a lot of people who potentially might be entering this industry. Make it happen. Enter the industry. That could be your purpose. And it's an exciting time. There's funding available now for this. Follow the dream, go for it. Have the tenacity, that Steve has to do something different and go for it and pursue that dream.
Thank you. These were very inspirational final words. Thank you so much for this fascinating conversation. I personally learned a lot. I hope our viewers and listeners too. And I'll let you both take you off to the next business appointments in your busy schedules. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thanks
very
very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Luxury on Air with Karine Sagari and Felicitas Morhart. This podcast is provided to you by Deloitte Switzerland and the Swiss Center for Luxury Research. If you've enjoyed this episode, you can leave us a 5-star review. If you're keen to stay up to date on what's trending in the luxury industry, don't forget to subscribe.